Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We're going to continue now where we left off Friday in the book Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. Remember, we were talking about how the Jesuits had been infiltrated into England in order to overthrow the Protestant crown of Queen Elizabeth and to make Roman Catholicism the state-sponsored religion and to restore the temporal power of the Pope in England. Now, retreating one paragraph for continuity purposes, it says in page 136, the first full paragraph, if you're following along in your own copy of the book, page 136, the first full paragraph, it says, under these circumstances, Elizabeth could not have remained unresisting if she had desired. To have done so would have been a treasonable abandonment of the country of which she was the legitimate sovereign. Not only was she assailed in all her rights as queen, but the Pope, adopting the views and opinions of the Jesuits, impudently attempted to justify resistance to her authority upon the ground that she was an illegitimate daughter of Henry VIII by Anne Boleyn, and therefore had no just right to exact obedience to her authority. In other words, Queen Elizabeth was a bastard, according to the definition of the Roman Catholic Church, and she was unqualified to be a sovereign of England. Now, stop and think about the history of the popes. Isn't this the pot calling the kettle black? I mean, the popes, remember, and the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, the priesthood, are forbidden by Roman Catholic canon law to marry. They're not allowed to marry. They're celibate, okay? Which does not mean they can't have relations with women. And they all did. And they all produced bastards. Okay? It's a common thing among the history of the popes that they had illegitimate children. Now here, the papacy and the Jesuits are assailing Elizabeth's right to be Queen of England based on the fact that the Pope had not annulled Henry VIII's first marriage to Catherine, and nor did he approve of his remarriage to Anne Boleyn. But nonetheless, Elizabeth was a product of that marriage, that illegal marriage to Anne Boleyn. And because of the hereditary nature of the monarchy in England, Elizabeth was left the successor and the rightful ruler, and she was unanimously approved by both Parliament and the House of Lords in England. She was the rightful heir to the throne, and she governed rightly. She found her legitimate crown being threatened by the Jesuits and by the papacy, and she took action to stop it. And it says here, the Jesuits impudently attempted to justify resistance to her authority, in other words, overthrow her crown, upon the ground that she was an illegitimate daughter of Henry VIII by Anne Boleyn, and therefore had no just right to exact obedience to her authority. She had no right to expect the people to obey her. And it says he went further than this and claimed jurisdiction over her conscience by commanding her to accept, quote, the communion of the Roman Church. In other words, she had to sign herself over as a Roman Catholic, to be baptized in the Roman Catholic Church and to accept the supreme spiritual and temporal authority of the Pope. And it says, which with queenly dignity she refused. So she is regarded as a heretic now by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, he required her to send ambassadors to the Council of Trent. The Pope required Queen Elizabeth, a Protestant, to send ambassadors to the Council of Trent. And this she also declined to do. So she's not only a heretic, she's an obstinate heretic. And it says, when she imprisoned Mary, Queen of Scots, he, the Pope, usurped jurisdiction over the case, although Mary was an English subject and undertook to procure her release. That Mary was a subject of England, and it was well within the jurisdiction of Elizabeth to imprison her. But the Pope took over jurisdiction of the case and undertook to procure her release for the reason only that she preferred Romanism to Protestantism. In other words, you can't imprison a Roman Catholic in England. The Protestant queen, the legitimate Protestant queen Elizabeth, had, according to the Pope, no right to imprison a Roman Catholic, especially one who was threatening to overthrow the crown. Now, he sought to aid the kings of France and Spain to make war upon England in the name of religion, to release Mary, to dethrone Elizabeth, and seize upon her crown, trying to incite a foreign war to overthrow. A land invasion of England by France and Spain. Roman Catholic France and Roman Catholic Spain, both papist countries, were commanded by the Pope to invade England, to free Mary, and to take Elizabeth off of her throne. And it says, failing in all these things and being baffled by Elizabeth, he caused a prosecution to be instituted at Rome to try in the papal court her title to the crown. A sham and a farce as ineffective as it was ridiculous and discreditable. In other words, they tried Elizabeth in absentia. The papacy set up a kangaroo court in Rome and went through all the motions of dethroning her without actually dethroning her. It was just a matter of record. Now, it is difficult to imagine a more presumptuous and impotent proceeding, but it is instructive as showing the pretensions of the popes of that period. Yes, the pretensions of the Pope at that period were that they were King of kings and Lord of lords, the divine right ruler of the world, the vicar, the replacement of Jesus Christ on the earth, and that every man, woman, and child ought to obey the Pope, and especially the kings and the queens over which the papacy claimed supreme jurisdiction. Now, in the papal indictment, Elizabeth was accused, among other things, of rejecting the ancient and supporting the new worship. In other words, she was accused of being a Protestant, of having, quote, received the sacrament after the manner of heretics. In other words, she participated in communion, Christian communion, believers' communion, under the pattern of Protestantism, that it was, the bread was not, and the wine was not, the literal blood, body, soul, and divinity of Christ to be sacrificed once again on the altar as a perpetual sacrifice, as if his one-time sacrifice on the cross was insufficient. No, she was Protestant, and she participated in Christian communion under the scriptural meaning of it, in that it was a memorial. Okay? This is, according to the Roman Catholic Church, the sacrament of the Mass, only Elizabeth observed communion, Christian communion, and not the sacrament of the Mass of the Roman Catholic Church. I hope I haven't confused my listeners. Many of my listeners, I'm sure, don't know the difference between the Mass and Christian communion. But nonetheless, Elizabeth rejected the Mass. She rejected transubstantiation. She rejected the notion that Christ must be sacrificed over and over and over again, and that she simply participated in the memorial. which is communion. And they also accused her of having, quote, chosen known heretics for the lords of her council. In other words, those 8 Protestants that she put on her council, never mind all the Catholics that she left in office after Mary left the throne unceremoniously. Quote, and having imposed an oath derogating from the rights of the Holy See. In other words, she swore an oath to the crown that did not pay deference to the Holy See or to the papacy. Okay, she swore a Protestant oath. And it says the Queen, of course, did not appear, but nevertheless, she was held to be in default, and the trial was conducted in the papal form. Okay, it ended with a judgment by the papacy. She was labeled a heretic and excommunicated, and of course, the papacy at this point demands that the people no longer obey her. Okay, this is the activities of Rome. All this took place without Elizabeth's presence. Now it says 12 English Roman Catholics who were represented as, quote, exiles for their religion, in other words, English Roman Catholics who had left the country, were examined by this court as witnesses, and after their evidence was heard and considered, quote, the judges pronounced their opinion that she had incurred the canonical penalties of heresy, unquote. So this kangaroo court continues. They've taken on as witnesses Roman Catholics, English Roman Catholics who'd come to Rome to testify against Elizabeth, and based on their testimony alone, without any rebuttal from Elizabeth, she was summarily described as a canonical heretic, according to Roman Catholic canon law. As the major one of these, which included all the minors, was the forfeiture of her crown, that is, her actual dethronement. That's what they sought to do. By all this rigmarole in Rome was to justify legally dethroning her and demonstrating the power of the papacy to do so. Now, it is to be supposed that in the decree of the Roman Curia, all this was recorded in solemn form. But this decree, like those of other courts, did not execute itself. In other words, the papacy was powerless to carry his sentence into effect by actually dethroning Elizabeth. And it says, therefore, the Pope provided for its execution by issuing his pontifical bull with all necessary gravity and composure, whereby he pronounced Elizabeth guilty of heresy, deprived of her quote-unquote pretended right to the crown of England, and absolved her subjects from all allegiance to her. In other words, since the Pope was incapable of dethroning Elizabeth, he tried to incite a civil war, Roman Catholics to rise up in England and to physically take her off the throne, as a matter of ecclesiastical censure by the Pope. Now, notwithstanding the long period intervening between those and the present time, we're not relieved from the obligation and necessity of understanding fully upon what pretense of authority Pope Pius V assumed the prerogative right to pluck from the head of the English Queen a crown placed there with practical, if not absolute, unanimously placed there by the English people. Okay? We're not relieved of our responsibility to understand the circumstances as they are unfolding in this history. We're not allowed to suppose that this is just a unique period of time. The papacy has never renounced its power to seat and to unseat kings and queens and potentates. It still regards itself as a matter of infallible Roman Catholic canon law to be the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But this queen, who was anathematized by the papacy, declared a heretic, declared a bastard, legally unlawful to sit on the throne of England, who could not dethrone her, literally tried to incite a civil war. Remember, they had already tried to use France and Spain to throw her off the throne. They tried to corrupt Mary, Queen of Scots. They tried to influence Ireland and Scotland both to dethrone her. They did everything they possibly could to get Elizabeth off the throne. But she still ruled and reigned in England. And it says it is not enough to say that these things occurred in another age and under circumstances peculiar to that age. This may sufficiently explain the conduct of individuals and the character and structure of governments, all of which have ever been and will continue to be liable to change. But the laws of God, founded on divine wisdom, are not subject to these changes. The creative power of the deity alone can change them. It is the special boast of the papists and of the Jesuits that the system of laws which govern the papacy has the stamp of divine approval upon it, and that therefore it has always been, and still remains the same. Semper eadem is their motto. In other words, always the same. Hence, it is important to us to know the nature and extent of the spiritual powers asserted by Pope Pius V over the English government and its people, in order to ascertain whether, if a parallel case existed today or may exist hereafter, the same papal powers may not be again invoked. So again, the author is reminding us, don't just pass this off as irrelevant history. This history is vital for our understanding what is happening in the United States today. If the papacy then claimed power over kings and queens, even to the extent of inciting a civil war to overthrow a legitimate government, or to order a foreign invasion of Roman Catholic countries against a Protestant nation, or to incite rebellion of adjoining states to overthrow the crown, and at last to have a trial in absentia to overthrow a legitimate government. Is there a parallel case in the world today that currently exists where the papacy is diligently trying to overthrow a government that it does not approve of? Yes, there is, and it's the United States of America for the same reasons. The papacy would like nothing than to find a day when it could incite its own people, the Roman Catholics of this country, to rise up and overthrow the government, or to use Roman Catholic nations in a foreign invasion, a land invasion of the country, to overthrow the government. This is the whole purpose of studying this history, is to realize the potential of the papacy in the modern political world, and never permitting oneself to dismiss these periods of history in England and Germany and France and Spain and Portugal as just a long dead era that is no longer a threat. The papacy has never renounced this pretended power of the Pope as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And R.W. Thompson is wise to warn American people about this reality. And it says, hence it is important to us to know the nature and extent of the spiritual powers asserted by Pope Pius V over the English government and people, in order to ascertain whether, if a parallel case existed today or may exist hereafter, the same papal powers may not be again invoked. The question which most concerns us is not whether they may or may not be asserted, but whether or no they have been embodied in the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church and have been thereby stamped with the character of perpetuity. No special pleading, however adroit, can make the issue otherwise. So he's simply saying, are these laws still in effect today? The answer is unequivocally yes. All these powers are still held by the papacy to overthrow legitimately elected governments. And remember, in England, Elizabeth was loved by Catholics and Protestants alike, by Parliament and the House of Lords alike. She was unanimously approved in England. There was no one who questioned her authority in the government. It was the papacy that opposed her queenship, her throne. Now, the questions tried and decided at Rome by the papal curia, insofar as it involved the right to the English crown, was exclusively political, and the Pope could not rightfully change its character by assuming that it was brought within his spiritual jurisdiction by virtue of the universality of his spiritual powers. It was an English and not a Roman question. By the existing laws of England, Elizabeth was the rightful and hereditary heir to the throne and had possession of the crown. It had been so decided by the Parliament and ratified by the people with a unanimity almost unknown in those times. She was queen not only de facto, but de jure. In other words, she was a queen not only in fact, but rightfully. And it says, by what mode of reasoning or by what perversion of language could the Pope take to himself jurisdiction over such a question? England was governed by laws, and whether they appear to us now to have been right or wrong, they were her own laws, enacted by her rightful authorities. They were exclusively political laws, providing for her own government and her own people. The Pope was the spiritual head of the Roman Catholic Church with a recognized jurisdiction over the spiritual welfare of those who regarded themselves as within that jurisdiction. In other words, Roman Catholics. By the methods of reasoning then adopted by the English nation, and now familiar to all intelligent American minds, all who chose to remain within that spiritual jurisdiction had the perfect right to do so. All who did not had an equal right to withdraw from it. Okay, England preserved the right not to be Roman Catholic, and it also preserved the rights of Roman Catholics to be Roman Catholic. Now, I see we've come up on the break. We'll continue with the reading and discussion of the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits, when we return from the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. We'll be right back after this.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
In this day of economic uncertainty and soaring unemployment, safe investments are often hard to find. But investing in the precious metals is the safest investment of all, because gold and silver is real money. Government-printed currency is not. Call Melody Cedarstrom at Discount Gold and Silver Trading Company at 1-800-375-4188. Melody has been helping people secure their financial future for over 10 years. While others in the business claim honesty, Melody will deliver. Give her a call, 1-800-375-4188. That's 800-375-4188.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. If you would like to support Inquisition Update, please support FirstAmendmentRadio.com, who sponsors the program. Now, the Pope was the spiritual head of the Church at Rome, with a recognized jurisdiction over the spiritual welfare of those regarding themselves as within that jurisdiction. In other words, he had a legitimate spiritual authority over Roman Catholics, according to English belief. Now, by the methods of reasoning then adopted by the English nation, and now familiar to all intelligent American minds, all who chose to remain within that spiritual jurisdiction had the perfect right to do so. All who did not had an equal right to withdraw from it. In other words, there was religious liberty and toleration in England under Elizabeth. Now, rights of this character concern individuals, not nations, except as their populations shall decide, in which case they may submit or not to this jurisdiction at their pleasure. The English nation, by its domestic laws, had established a system of government suitable for itself, and had placed its crown upon Elizabeth's head. To say that the Pope had the divine right, as the spiritual head of the Church of Rome, to set this national government aside and substitute for it another dictated by himself, and after the papal mode, means this and this only: that his spiritual power includes political and temporal power over all nations, to the extent of requiring them to adopt whatsoever form of religious faith the Pope shall describe, to the absolute exclusion of all other forms. And it allows him, moreover, to employ for that purpose, against every domestic law to the contrary, all the papal machinery of coercion, force. The decree pronounced at Rome against Elizabeth affirms, in effect, that such is the canon law, that is, the law of the Church. Have the provisions of that law been authoritatively changed or abrogated since the time of Pope Pius V and Elizabeth? It may be necessary to find the answer to this question when we come to see, as we shall, that at Jesuit dictation it has been authoritatively announced that the time has come, or is rapidly approaching, when the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church shall be introduced into the United States to supersede such of our laws, national and state, as are in conflict with it. R.W. Thompson is warning us that there's coming a time in the United States when Roman Catholic canon law will be asserted to replace the laws established by this country. We're going to see the same usurpation in Protestant America that the papacy tried to assert over the legitimate government of England. The laws of the United States will be replaced by Roman Catholic canon law, at least those laws that are in contradiction to Roman Catholic canon law. That's exactly what's happening today. The presidents of the United States don't rule by the approval of legislature. They simply issue presidential directives, like a dictator, like a monarch, like a pope. And, of course, the legislature passed, without even reading it, the Patriot Act. And all you have to do is Google the Patriot Act, read the tenets of the Patriot Act for yourself in context with the history that we're reading, and you'll discover that it sets aside our Constitution and Bill of Rights and replaces it with Roman Catholic canon law. It's happening right before our very eyes. The very thing that R.W. Thompson is telling us is coming to pass right now before our very eyes. He says, it may be necessary to find the answer to this question when we come to see, as we shall, that at Jesuit dictation, it has been authoritatively announced that the time has come, or is rapidly approaching, when the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church shall be introduced into the United States to supersede such of our laws, national and state, that is federal and state law, as are in conflict with it. The Jesuits are going to dictate, just as they tried to do in England. And they're going to strike down every federal and state law that is in conflict with Roman Catholic canon law. That means our Constitution is going to be thrown down because it conflicts with Roman Catholic canon law. As a matter of fact, our entire form of government is in contrast with Roman Catholic canon law, in conflict with Roman Catholic canon law. It's a government of, by, and for the people, but the papacy says the people are not to govern. By God, they are not given the wherewithal to govern themselves. In other words, the Holy Spirit and the Scriptures are not sufficient for the people to govern themselves. No, they need a pope. They don't need God's law. They need Roman Catholic canon law. And they're going to force it upon us at Jesuit dictation. That's exactly what's happening in the country today. R.W. Thompson continues, he says, for the present, we must not pass by too rapidly the conflict between the Pope and Elizabeth to the principles involved, in which enough consideration is not generally given in order that we may comprehend fully what it meant and how, in the end, it turned the nation upon their progressive courses and brought them where they are now. In all history, there are few more instructive lessons. In carrying on the war against Elizabeth, the Jesuits did not forget the work of educating young Englishmen so as to make them believe that treason was one of the highest virtues when dictated by what they chose to consider the interests of religion. That is, of the papacy or of their society, the Jesuit order, just as we have seen they did in Germany. Among other seminaries of learning, they had one at Reims in France, established by the Cardinal of Lorraine, one of the most vindictive persecutors of the French Protestant Huguenots. They had another at Douai, also in France. From these, colonies of Jesuits were sent to England every year, instructed and trained to subvert the English government, and particularly to vilify and calumniate Elizabeth by accusing her of leading a quote-unquote licentious and voluptuous private life, unquote. Imagine a Roman Catholic priest criticizing the decadent or sinful life of an American politician in light of the global pedophile priest pandemic in the world. But the Jesuits have no shame. The popes have no shame. In spite of the most despicable history of any group of men on planet Earth that ever lived, the papacy dares to criticize other people's lives. There's no greater demonstration of hypocrisy anywhere in the world. It says they had another college at Douai, also in France, and from these colonies of Jesuits were sent to England every year, instructed and trained to subvert the English government and particularly to vilify and calumniate Elizabeth by accusing her of leading a licentious and voluptuous private life. Do you know there's no history of anything such as this? But the Jesuits accused her of it anyway. Simply made up lies about her to bring her into disfavor in a country that had previously unanimously approved her. It says it is not easy to understand what force was intended to be given to this accusation as an argument against her right to the crown, in view of the fact that a life tenfold more licentious and voluptuous than that falsely charged against Elizabeth did not invalidate the right of Pope Alexander VI to the papal crown and the headship of the Church at Rome. He gives Pope Alexander VI as the example of papal corruption, papal moral corruption. And we read the book by John Bond, In the Pillory, is all about the life of Pope Alexander VI. And much of it wasn't even fit to read on this program. But read it I did, every single word of it, to give my listeners just one example of one of the most corrupt, licentious, filthy popes that ever lived. And yet they dared to insinuate that Elizabeth lived a licentious and voluptuous life, and to try to justify her overthrow from the legitimate authority that she was given by the people, unanimously in England. It says, nevertheless, the Jesuits availed themselves of it without regard either to the truthfulness or their own consistency. They were educated to this particular kind of work, and it was considered their duty to educate others in the same way, leaving the consequences to take care of themselves. Hume gives this account of these Jesuit emissaries to England, quote, they infused into all their votaries an extreme hatred against the Queen, whom they treated as a usurper, a schismatic, a heretic, a persecutor of the Orthodox, and one solemnly and publicly anathematized by the Holy Father, the quote-unquote Holy Father. They treated her as a usurper. What is the Pope? Is he not a usurper of Christ's rightful throne? A schismatic. They accused Elizabeth of being a schismatic. Is not the papacy and all of his laws and all of his pretended power a schism against the Lord of glory? A heretic. They accused Elizabeth of being a heretic. But is not the papacy heretical from its very foundation? A persecutor of the Orthodox. Do you know your scriptures tells you that the papacy is, and the Roman Catholic Church is drunk with the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus? And they solemnly and publicly anathematized Queen Elizabeth, the rightful heir to the throne of England, duly approved by everybody in the country. They called her everything that they were. When will the injustice end? And by what means would the Jesuit order condemn our government and recommend its overthrow and replacement by a papal government, one following the example of the popes? It says sedition, rebellion, sometimes assassination were the expedients by which they intended to effect their purposes against her, pretending to find in the existing state of things in England justification for all this, even for the assassination of the Queen. Two Jesuit leaders, Campion and Parsons, were sent from Rome to give direction to the movements of the conspirators already there. In order more effectively to encourage treason and sedition, they, quote, pretended to be Protestants, unquote, not being ashamed of this false profession, because the obligation to practice deception when necessary was instilled into their minds by Jesuit training, and on that account created no compunctions of conscience. When Parsons reached Dover, the better to practice his disguise, he wore the uniform of an English army officer and pretended to be such. In this way, he deceived the inspecting officer and arranged with him for the safe passage of Campion, whom he represented as a fellow officer who would follow in a few days. It may thus be seen how easy it is to be, quote, all things to all men, unquote, when those who desire to become so have quieted their consciences with the belief that falsehood and deception may be rightly employed to promote, quote, the greater glory of God, unquote. This is Satan's tricks. They train themselves in Satan's duplicities and then use them themselves for the quote-unquote greater glory of God. This is exactly what P.D. Stewart said in his book. We talked about it the other day. It says, however incomprehensible may be the casuistry by which the mind can be brought to this belief, it is perfectly plain to a Jesuit and is doubtless explained in their schools. In other words, the Jesuit universities in this country, the most prestigious universities of this country, teach this sort of thing. And then out of their graduates, they pick people to go into the Jesuit order to perpetuate the Jesuit order, and other graduates of these Jesuit schools are placed in the highest positions in our government and in our churches. They're trained in the ways of duplicity and casuistry, sophistry, equivocation, mental reservation. In other words, they are taught lying as a science. He says it is exceedingly difficult to separate the true from the false in the history of the times here referred to. The passions of the rival parties became so intense as seemingly to render agreement between them impossible, either with regard to facts or conclusions. It may not even be safe to assume that the truth lies midway between these extremes, but there is always, in the influences of effects produced by any given period of time, that which explains the motives and the purposes of the chief actors. By careful investigation of these, we acquire a knowledge of the philosophy of history. You want to know about history? You have to use careful investigation, looking for the motives of these people, especially when the fog of facts becomes so thick you can't cut it with a knife. You have to look at the motives. And he says, conducting our investigation in this spirit, we cannot fail to conclude that the interference with the domestic and internal affairs of England by an alien and foreign power, the papacy and the Jesuits, was a flagrant act of usurpation, unless the spiritual authority of the Pope gave him rightful jurisdiction over temporal and political questions in that country. And if he did rightfully possess this jurisdiction in 1570, when Pius V fulminated his pontifical bull against Elizabeth and derived it from the divine law, we of the present age, and especially in the United States, cannot refrain from inquiring whether, from the Jesuit standpoint, Leo XIII, who was the Pope at the time of the writing of this book, from the Jesuit standpoint, Leo XIII does not possess the same jurisdiction derived from the same law. The answer is simply yes. The papacy has always claimed the rights that they exerted in England. And they will likewise use the same rights to overthrow the legitimate government of the United States. And it says, without pressing this inquiry here, however, it is deemed more essential to ascertain still more minutely how far the Jesuits were responsible for sowing the seeds of discord and civil war in England, when otherwise Protestants and Roman Catholics might, at the Elizabethan period, have lived and associated harmoniously together as they did in Germany before the Jesuits appeared there. Many intelligent readers of history fail to give due consideration to the events of this important period. What made this period important? Because it demonstrated the same set of circumstances that existed here in exist here in the United States today. Religious freedom, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. Roman Catholics freely practicing their religion right alongside Protestants and seemingly getting along just fine. But what did the Jesuits do during this period of time? They incited war, civil war, foreign war, ecclesiastical war, temporal war, every kind of war to overthrow the legitimate Protestant government of England. Would they not do the same? Would they not claim the same rightful divine jurisdiction to do so today? Have they ever removed the tenets of these acts from the canon law of the Roman Catholic Church? The answer is an unequivocal no. It says, we have seen upon the authority of Lingard, a papal historian, that Elizabeth was at the beginning of her reign desirous of holding an equal balance between the rival bodies of Christians, Protestants and Catholics. Her mind was not fully made up with regard to her own faith, although it is probable she was inclined to Protestantism. There were reasons for this, some of which may have been controlling with a masculine mind like hers. The relations between her father, Henry VIII, and the papacy must have created impressions not favorable to the Pope as a sharer in her governing power over the English people. And the reign of her sister Mary, Bloody Mary, must have tended to strengthen rather than to remove these impressions. She could not have failed to know that Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain had brought with it to England a series of calamities, the remembrance of which must have made her not only sorrowful, but indignant. If Mary's natural inclination had been kindly and her heart benevolent, it must have been apparent to Elizabeth that these good qualities had been exchanged for others of the very opposite character, which had incited her to persecute and prosecute her Protestant subjects in the spirit of intense religious bigotry, and as if God had acceptably served by shedding blood. Bloody Mary. She did it in the name of God. Was God served by it? Mary believed that she was serving God by shedding the blood of innocent Protestants, Bible believers in England. That's the very nature of Roman Catholicism. When they kill us, they think they're doing God's service. And he continues, he says, and when, upon coming to the throne as the immediate successor of Mary, Elizabeth found herself confronted by the terrible condition into which England had been thrown, with every evil passion aroused and little ground for hope of the future, nothing was more natural than the belief that this state of things had been produced, mainly, if not entirely, by the unfortunate marriage of Mary with Spanish Philip II, who possessed such a combination of bad qualities as left room for scarcely a single good one. Sullen, morose, and selfish, Philip separated himself from everything in life calculated to encourage good or benevolent emotions, and gave free play to that bad ambition which led him to desolate the Netherlands by cruelties as unparalleled as they were atrocious. He had no affection for Mary, being incapable of any such emotion. His marriage with her was a matter of policy alone, one of those political unions which, in the course of time, have produced evils to all the governments of Europe. He had inherited religious fanaticism from his father, Charles V, but without any of the better qualities of the latter, and gave such excessive indulgence to his hatred of Protestants that nothing rejoiced him so much as to know that the dungeons of the Inquisition were crowded with them. We'll continue tomorrow.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.